Hello and welcome to the second week's presentation for Sula. As usual, we're continuing a novel, so there won't be as many slides this week. Um, just a refresher, we ended last week with Nell getting married to Jude, and at the reception, Sula sort of takes off walking down the road, and that's where we're left. And when we pick up this week, we see that 10 years have passed. It's now 1937, and Sula is coming back to town. We don't immediately learn where she's been, although we do eventually learn that she went to college and traveled the world, saw lots of different parts of the country. And when she returns, I wanted to point out the fact that it starts with a strong connection to the natural world. You know, we've talked about that in relation to many of the rural novels we've looked at so far, that the environment and nature impact not only the plot, you know, and Bless Me Ultima Antonio had to run from the Luna farm to home to try to stop uh, the the killing of Ultima. And because that natural world was rough and distant and they were far apart and isolated, that actually affected the plot. But it also sometimes affects characters and even theme. So, for example, here, when Sula returns after being gone for 10 years, she is accompanied by what the book calls a plague of robins. Lots of robins, the birds, just descend on the town. And I think it's very easy to realize that Morrison wants us to read this somewhat symbolically. So, a question arises: how does this help characterize Sula? That there's almost, and Sula does not have the supernatural aspects as Bless Me Ultima did, but there is a suggestion that somehow her return is almost a supernatural occurrence. There are signs and portents about her return. Not just anybody would walk into town with doves accompanying them. Now, of course, the realistic explanation is she just came when the doves were going to, or they, I say doves. We're going to read a book called The Plague of Doves. The robins arrived, so she just happened to coincide with that. But I think the more important question is, what does this tell us about the community? If this is, you know, an accident or a coincidence, is that really the important thing, or is it that the community doesn't view it as such? That to them, Sula returning with this plague of robins is enough to tell them that this is, at first, maybe not a bad event, although they certainly sort of decide that, but an event worth paying attention to. The attention of the community to the natural world and how it interacts with events is important to consider here, and also I think important to a lot of rural literature. The natural world, as opposed to more of the man-made structural world of the town in this case. And this, I think, is a place where rural literature stands apart from some others. There are certainly more urban and suburban stories that, you know, where something like weather would roll in, but because there is less access to the natural world in those places, the interaction between the two is often not as grounded in the forefront. So, something to think about as you start reading this, or as you started reading this section. So here we are, one of these block of text slides. I try to avoid these as much as possible, but every once in a while there's a passage that just needs to be considered in whole and unpacked a little bit. And we get this early on. It's during the sort of narration of Sula's return, but at this moment, it's more of a general reflection on the community. And it says, what was taken by outsiders to be slackness, slovenliness, or even generosity was in fact a full recognition of the legitimacy of forces other than good ones. They did not believe doctors could heal. For them, none ever had done so. They did not believe death was accidental. Life might be, but death was deliberate. They did not believe nature was ever askew, only inconvenient. Plague and drought were as natural as springtime. If milk could curdle, God knows robins could fall. The purpose of evil was to survive it, and they determined, without ever knowing they had made up their minds to do so, to survive floods, white people, tuberculosis, famine, and ignorance. They knew anger well, but not despair. And they didn't stone sinners for the same reason they didn't commit suicide. It was beneath them. So, I could spend the next hour talking about everything this passage contains. I'm not going to do that, obviously. What I am going to do is point out that this gives us a sense of this rural community. And I don't think this rural community through this passage is the same as the ones we have seen before. Yes, there is a sense of engagement with what we might call the supernatural or the world of the idea of good and evil, which we saw to some extent in Bless Me Ultima, and a little bit in Weinsberg, especially with Jesse Bentley. But there's also a very specific suggestion here that the purpose of evil was to survive it. So this is not the good versus evil of the world of Bless Me Ultima. This is evil is a force, and its whole purpose for coming into the town is to allow the town to survive it, to make them, I think you could suggest, stronger, right? So in this way, evil almost serves a purpose in the town, the ability to resist it, which I don't think we've seen before. So that's something to consider. We talk in the threads a lot about how are these communities all similar and how are they different. They're very similar in a lot of ways, but this seems like an important difference, especially as the narrative continues and we see Sula starting to be viewed by the town as sort of an evil influence or a corrupting influence in their town. So at that point, Sula becomes the way by which the town believes it is becoming stronger, although we'll talk in a bit about how the absence of Sula actually changes the town in ways you might not expect. And after the long slide, here's a short one. A much more practical observation of Sula's return and how the community views it. It says on page 91, by the time she, meaning Sula, reached the bottom, the news of her return had brought the black people out on their porches or to their windows. There were scattered hellos and nods, but mostly stares. Now, this isn't nearly as deep or philosophical as the previous slide, but I do think it's worth noting and considering again, because this book is so intimately interested, not just in these characters, as we said last week, but how the town views these characters, how the town almost becomes a character in relation to and in response to some of these characters, especially Sula. So here I would ask, where have we seen this before? Where have we seen someone coming into the town and everybody else sort of coming out to take in their arrival, but without sort of directly engaging them? And I think you can look through all of the texts we've read, even those early texts. For example, this feels very much to me of a piece with Rip Van Winkle after he wakes up from his nap and returns. Although I think we've also seen versions of this in the beginning and end of Ethan Frome, when the narrator has come to town and people don't quite know what to make of him. And of course, we've seen it in Weinsberg. So how does this begin to fit our continuing definition or evolving idea of the rural? And I think it sort of suggests an aspect of the rural that I think is pretty observable in all of these texts and understandable, is the rural engages, but only to a certain point, right? Rural communities want to see what's going on, but they are also inherently suspicious of people that aren't familiar. Now, Sula is familiar, but she's been gone for 10 years, so she's not going to be familiar on a day-to-day basis the way the rest of the community would be. So it's sort of the friendly but not too friendly approach that I think we've seen elsewhere. And an easy consideration on this slide. Well, I don't want to say easy. It actually has pretty profound implications for our continuing ideas of the rural, but pretty direct moment in the book is when we discover that one of the things Sula did when she left was go to college. And she comes back and sort of by virtue of having gone to college is one of the only traditionally educated college educated people in the town. And while the text is not explicit in saying that, people don't like her for that, it helps sort of support her separation, her difference from the town. And I wonder how this adds to our evolving understanding of how education is viewed in rural communities. And when I say education, in this case, I'm talking specifically about formal institutional education, going to college. One of the great aspects of rural literature, I think, in general, is that it makes explicit the fact that There are many kinds of education. Some of the most intelligent people in some of the books we will read have never gone to college or maybe even finished high school. So they are educated in certain ways, but not formally. But here, Sula does receive a formal education, and I think it makes her seem, again, sort of different from the town. And we have seen this. Antonio doesn't fit in with his brothers or with other people because he takes his education seriously. People in Weinsberg who go off to college sort of either leave and don't come back or come back and are not satisfied with life in Weinsberg after becoming formally educated. Ethan Frome started a formal education, stopped, came back, and seems very unfulfilled because of that interrupted education. So I encourage you to consider sort of one of the main topics that you can sort of pin on the board for this entire class is the sort of continued presence of, value of, but also maybe distrust of formal education in rural places, and consider why that is the case. Is it that they distrust formal education per se, or is it because it is something that is rare enough that it just by default makes the educated person different and a little suspect to most of the group, most of the community, which wouldn't have received that? Another minor moment in the text that I think is worth mentioning. Again, I'm sure you've noticed that my focus in reading Sula for this class is largely on sort of the characterization of the rural community. And that's not because the story of Ava and Sula and Nell and Hannah isn't interesting. It's that it's pretty straightforward. I feel like it's a story that doesn't need a lot of unpacking to understand. I mean, certainly character motivation can get interesting and complicated, and how to view the character sort of symbolically is something to consider. But what's really interesting to me about this novel within the framework of rural literature is how it really does, I think, pull back the veneer a little bit. If you think about it, most of the communities that we have read about so far, propriety is a really important aspect, right? People were sort of very, very much ruled by the expectations of the community in Weinsberg and in Ethan Frome, and even in Bless Me Ultima, although there was more than one community in different parts of the community. Now, on one hand, that's true here as well. The people of the community are, as rural communities tend to be, on the conservative side, although I think there is less of a focus on propriety as a whole. There still is propriety, but it's a looser, freer town than we have seen elsewhere. And part of that, is just a different town, different time, different place. But watching the town's reaction to Sula, especially in the second half, helps us get more insight into what lines can't be crossed. For example, when Shadrach walks in at the beginning of the book and sets up National Suicide Day, they're bothered by it at first, and then they get used to it because they fit it into their expectation for the community. Sula, I don't think, ever quite fits in. She did early, before she left, but when she comes back, the town's distrust of her is, I don't think it's ever really assuaged. But at this moment, on this slide, we get an interesting moment, and I've sort of set it up bullet point wise, even though it's just dialogue in the text. So Sula and Nell are talking after she comes back. It's sort of that one confrontation they have, and Sula, because Nell is talking about how bad it is that Sula has put Ava in the old folks' home. Sula says, "Well, did you know that she burnt Plum?" Referring back to what did happen in the first half when Ava sets her son on fire. And Nell's response is very interesting here. "Oh, I heard that years ago," she says, "but nobody put no stock in it." Now, this is again one of those moments that's easy to just read past, but it really is worth considering. The reason Nell is able to dismiss that rumor is because she says nobody put no stock in it. Nobody means nobody in the town, which by extension suggests that the town decided not to believe it. And because the town decided not to believe it, Nell feels comfortable not believing it. And my question for you, I guess, is why is this a reason to discount the truth? The town believes what the town believes, and because people in small, close-knit communities tend to be somewhat homogenous in their views, um, that's enough for Nell. It's not enough for Sula. She knows the truth. But think again how often we have seen this, right? So think in Bless Me Ultima. The town, even when they are confronted with the fact that Ultima has power and uses it for good, still distrust her and call her a curandera, a witch, because the town has decided that that's how you view someone who can do what Ultima does. Um, how many people in Weinsberg were viewed the way they were because the town sort of not actively, not intentionally, not overtly, but sort of over time, over discussions in, over dinner tables and in the bars or whatever, sort of slowly reached this conclusion about that person. It drives some people out of the town. It breaks, I think, some people who stay in the town. But it's hard to discount the power of, I guess, what I would call sort of groupthink, especially in a small rural community. Does everybody do that? Absolutely not. Even people in this book sometimes operate outside of that. Tarbaby, even though he's not an important character, we have no indication that he cares one way or the other about these things, for example. But taken as a whole, a large percentage of the town sort of reaches these groupthink conclusions. And that is, I think, sometimes a benefit, but often a drawback to rural culture as characterized in these books. Another interesting moment in this 1937 chapter, which really does contain a lot of good material for consideration, is that Sula, who has lived in the cities and come from the city and spent time in the city after leaving home, suggests at one point that hell, at least the concept of hell that sort of traditional Christian dogma shares and sort of promulgates in small towns, is a thing that lasts forever, and that's what makes it hell. Something lasting forever and never changing is hell for Sula. Now Nell, having never left Medallion after briefly visiting New Orleans as a child, says the opposite. She says, hell ain't things lasting forever. Hell is change. And this is just one of those really interesting moments where you take a sort of interesting philosophical moment in the dialogue, in the text, and you can apply it so many ways. And I think the way we can apply it in a rural literature novel is to say this is a moment where we get a sense of the dichotomy between urban and rural, right? So the lure of the city for Sula and for most people that go there is there's so much going on. There's always something to do. There's a great variety of people, of experiences, of cultures. Things are constantly changing. They're constantly different. So for Sula to come from a city and see the sort of unchanging rural world of Medallion says, well, this is sort of hell, right? After having access to so much variety and change and excitement, this is not a good thing. And if that sounds familiar, think back to Kate Swift in Weinsberg, who goes to Europe, sees the world, and then comes back to Weinsberg. And I don't think she calls it hell, but has the same sort of viewpoint. Now think of Nell, who sees the opposite. The worst thing she can imagine is change. Now, why is that? Partially because her relationship with Jude has changed because of Sula, and she is not coping well with that change. But she is also someone who has lived years and years in a relatively unchanging environment. Change comes to rural places, but it comes very slowly. And so rural communities tend to cling to the past as a source of stability. If Main Street has had the same stores for 20 years, then when one of those stores closes, it's very jarring in a way that it would never be in a less rural location. A store changes in, the downtown of a city, or even in a suburb, and you just sort of go, oh, what's the new thing coming in? But there's a sense of loss that accompanies change in a rural location because change happens less frequently, and so it's felt more keenly. So that doesn't mean one is right and one is wrong. There are reasons to like and dislike change. There are reasons to like and dislike stability. But I think stability and resistance to change we are seeing as we keep reading is sort of a hallmark of American rural culture of the last 115 years or so. I sort of already touched on this slide in an earlier slide when I got to sort of a broader discussion of the town and how it reacts to things, but I think it is worth just pointing out again that after Sula comes back, the townspeople begin to believe that she is the cause of a rash of unfortunate events. Um, the boy falling down the stairs, etc. And eventually, we even get this line that, quote, they believed that she was laughing at their God. Um, if we accept that the idea of God is the idea of a good, omnipotent being, then if she's laughing at that, then she is at best sort of a trickster character who sort of rejects the rule and order of law, and at worst she does embody the evil that we talked about earlier. But I'm sure as you're reading you start to think, well, this seems juvenile, this seems unnecessarily superstitious. It's just a person coming back home. So I would encourage you to consider what explains this easy belief in superstition. And when I say superstition, I'm not talking about the whole idea of God or the entrenched religion of the town, but I'm talking about how they then translate that into Sula coming back to town as almost a supernatural event. And I would also encourage you to consider how this belief in superstition is similar or different from what we see in Bless Me Ultima. It's different, certainly in the sense that the things that happen in Bless Me Ultima seem harder to discount. It really is sort of, at times, a truly supernatural story, whereas we don't see evidence for that in Sula. But other than that, how is it similar or different? I mean, it's certainly similar in the fact that the community uses these supernatural ideas and beliefs to explain things. But I think it's different, too, in that its focus on the individual here is not always something we saw in Bless Me Ultima. I mean, certainly there were the witch sisters and their father, I mean, were sort of viewed as bad or evil, but not as influencing events the way that Sula seems to here. So as we move forward into the 1939 chapter, we learn that after Nell shunned Sula because she cheated with Jude, Sula decides that now, and this is a quote, now Nell belonged to the town and all of its ways. And we are very much, I think, expected by Morrison to read this as a gulf between them. Whereas Sula resists conformity to the town and even threatens the town in some ways from the town's point of view, the thing that ultimately separates them is that Nell gives herself over to the town. That unlike the young, imaginative girl that she was when they were kids, she has now become part of the town. So I wonder, of all the ways that this divide between them could be characterized. I mean, Sula cheated with Nell's husband Jude, so that's a pretty obvious way to characterize the divide between them. But here Morrison does it by saying that Nell is of the town, and that is the thing that Sula can't bridge. That Sula hasn't simply lost Nell, she's lost her to the town, which is the least recoverable sort of loss for Sula. In other words, Sula, the individual who resists conformity in the town, her friend is lost to her because she conforms to the town. And again, I think this echoes Kate Swift and some of these characters who did go away and come back different and don't quite fit back into the town. So this is, once again, something we have seen and continue to see in these novels. And while we're talking about things we've seen elsewhere, in the 1939 chapter again, Sula starts to have a relationship with Ajax. And for the most part, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Ajax, because again, that relationship is pretty straightforward, although it certainly has an effect on how we view Sula, the person who never needed anyone, suddenly realizing she might need Ajax, and then almost immediately after admitting that weakness, she gets sick and dies. So there's a lot of symbolism to read into that. But you may have noticed this. An interesting moment regarding Ajax is when we learn that his job takes him away from the town and into the larger cities in the Ohio region here. And we get this passage that people thought that those long trips he, meaning Ajax took to larger cities in the state were for some sophisticated good times they could not imagine, but only envy. Actually, he was leaning against the barbed wire of airports, or nosing around hangars just to hear the talk of the men who were fortunate enough to be in the trade. And this passage highlights the expectation versus the reality of the urban. We have talked again and again about the characters we've seen who can't wait to get out of the small town and get to the city. And the suggestion here is that when you finally do get to the city, it's not that great. So where else have we seen this? Well, we saw, and the name is going to escape me, but the character in Weinsberg that actually did go to New York City and ultimately had to come back because the city was not what he expected. Ethan Frome, even though he went to college and enjoyed that, when his wife Xena goes to the city and comes back, he is very distrustful of what she brings back with her. So there is this idea that the grass is greener on the other side, or I guess if it's a city, the concrete is greener on the other side. And while this is not necessarily central to understanding Sula as a character, I think it is important to understand that the town believes this about Ajax. People, it says, thought that he, on those long trips, he does these things. And yet the reality is their idea of the rural is romanticized, and it is not the amazing, quote, good times that they think he's having. So another consideration, this time in the 1940 chapter, just before Sula's death, we learn that she has this thought through the narrative. It was as though for the first time she was complete alone, where she had always wanted to be, free of the possibility of distraction. So just before she dies, alone in her bedroom, she considers the fact that she has finally arrived where she always wanted to be, free of the possibility of distraction. Now, there are many lenses that you can read this through, certainly in her relationship to Nell and in her relationship to the world that she has seen in the busy cities, but I think that it's also a comment on the rural, because she has resisted the rural. She has left the rural. She has finally come back, but still not been a part of it. So in this moment, death, true aloneness, makes her free of the possibility of distraction. If the rural culture that she refused to be a part of was the source of distraction, then what does that tell us about Sula's view of the rural and maybe the novel's characterization of the rural? So in a lesser novel, the death of Sula would be the climax. You know, it would be the story of Sula. That's the name of the novel. We would have gotten her life, the complications, her death, and that would have been it. But in this novel, Sula dies, and then the story sort of goes on. The town is actually relieved that Sula has died. They think that the sort of the evil or the problems that she brought back with her will abate. And yet, when she dies, the town itself actually grows more restless and antagonistic toward itself and toward those around them, without her to motivate better behavior. The suggestion is, with Sula in the town, as an example of badness or evil, that the town then had an example of what not to be and therefore treated each other better. Without her, they fall back into bad behavior themselves. Almost as if, as the second bullet point says, that she was a sort of safety valve. She was the warning that kept them on the straight and narrow. So she dies and they start to fall off the straight and narrow. What does that tell us about the town and maybe about rural communities generally? The idea that even though we sometimes negatively associate sort of coming together to face a threat to the town or even within the town, that those threats help build the character of rural locations. And without that threat, the close-knit nature of the town somewhat collapses in this case. So I mentioned in the previous slide that the death of Sula is not the climax of the novel. In fact, the climax of both this chapter and the novel itself is basically when the restlessness, the the uncertainty that is inspired or caused, the town might say, by Sula's death, um, prompts many of the residents of the bottoms to ransack the partially constructed tunnel. And then, of course, as they're doing it, the tunnel collapses, and many people of the town die in the collapse. So, taken solely as an actual event in the novel, this moment can be a little confusing. You sort of wonder, well, why are people acting like this all of a sudden? But taken more symbolically, that without sort of the unifying power of Sula, and sort of given the exterior forces pushing in on this community, the fact that they want these jobs, but the white construction people won't give them to them. And also, you have to realize it's 1941, so we've been in the Great Depression, that there is a sort of pent up rage, frustration that grows out of this town. And so I think reading this climax, which is very strange and very sort of unexpected, I think, that is a useful way to read it. That it is a reaction to a variety of powerful and problematic forces. Perhaps, in a way, you could even read it as being a reaction to the evil that was mentioned in the earlier passage when we started the presentation. The idea that evil exists in order for them to resist it. Well, they're resisting what they perceive as evil here, and ultimately they resist it with their lives. But I don't think the novel necessarily thinks that's a bad thing. So, something to consider about a very strange moment at the end of the novel. And then in the final section of the novel, we flash forward all the way from 1941 to 1965, so 24 years later, the 1960s. And an entirely different group of people now sort of inhabit the town. The people who were main characters or young characters in the original chapters would be the old people now if they didn't die in the tunnel collapse. And so we have a new generation having taken over the town. And we get this chapter, and this is one of those, or this passage in the chapter, and this is one of those moments that really does feel like direct commentary on the rural experience. It says, "These young ones kept talking about the community, but they left the hills to the poor, the old, the stubborn, and the rich white folks. Maybe it hadn't been a community, but it had been a place. Now there weren't any places left, just separate houses with separate televisions and separate telephones, and less dropping by." So clearly, this is a commentary on the change in rural culture. We haven't seen much of this yet. Most of the cultures we've looked at, with the exception of Rip Van Winkle, where he comes back 20 years later to see how things have changed, are pretty static. I guess there is a little change in Bless Me Ultima in remembering the way things used to be, but most of the story takes place in the present time. So this is our first real glimpse at the fact that for all of its embrace of consistency and rejection of change, even the rural community is not able to avoid change. Eventually things do change, and in this case, the change leads to less of a community, separate houses, separate televisions, separate phones. The idea that there was a time when the community really was a communal experience, and now it's sort of a collection of people living separate lives within a geographical space. And I think if you go back to Sula and Nell's idea of hell as change versus hell as staying the same, I think this passage lends some support. I think, whereas the unchanging nature of the town through most of the book, I think, supported Sula's idea that that was sort of a hell. I think this final moment maybe supports Nell's view a little bit, that this change is the root of some problems, some trouble, a loss of something, an identity, a communal spirit that is not there. And I asked you a few weeks ago about how you think Weinsberg would appear if it still existed today compared to in the novel. And I think this might actually comment on that. Weinsberg would still be there. It would still maybe even look largely the same, but it would be a community of people who mostly keep their doors closed. Because, rural communities have often become that as crime, as drugs, and these sorts of things make their way from the urban to the rural. there is less a sense of openness, and I think that's a loss that is being explored in this moment. And finally, as the novel comes to a close, surprise, surprise, we end in another cemetery. We have seen the cemetery in Ethan Frome. We've heard references to the cemetery in Weinsberg. We've seen burials in Bless Me Ultima. Uh, the rural has no particular claim to the cemetery. Um, any culture, any urban, suburban, rural, uh, the tradition in the United States, at least until recently, has been to bury the dead in a cemetery and put markers up. Sometimes, like in Ethan Frome, those are small family plots on property. Sometimes, as in here, they are larger community cemeteries. But as Nell stands in this cemetery at the grave of Sula, we get this passage. They were not dead people. They were words. Not even words. Wishes. Longings. And I would ask you to consider how this cemetery is maybe different than the one we see in Ethan Frome or the one we hear referred to in Weinsberg. What is the symbolism? It's important to identify symbols in literature. In fact, you may very well see questions that pop up on maybe an exam asking you to interpret symbolism. So I just want to draw your attention to symbols when they appear. I can't answer the question for you as to what this cemetery represents. I mean, I think one answer would be that it represents sort of the past and loss, which is a very general symbolism for a cemetery. But here I think she is more explicit in the symbolism that it represents wishes and longings. The burial of rural people often are accompanied by things they didn't get to do, places they didn't get to see. So that's a consideration to leave you with. Not the only answer, probably not even the best answer, but an example of how to consider symbolism and symbols in literary texts. So thank you very much for paying attention. I think that does it for Sula, and we will pick up next week with the next text.